Depression breath. No, it's not a new strain, but instead a new potential way of figuring out if somebody has depression. Instead of just like asking them questions, maybe we can look at their breath. So how does it work and how accurate might it be? So sometimes I just fall down a rabbit hole of incredibly fascinating scientific articles and I'm not sure which ones to do. And today's example is one of those. So I actually just make a little wheel and spin them. If you have any ideas about things you want to put on the wheel, let me know. And today it came up as depression breath. And today's topic is especially interesting to me because it touches on like this main idea that a lot of students are kind of confused about when they first hear. And that's this idea that there is no specific like biomarker for depression. So there is no brain scan that you can look at and determine if somebody is depressed. Depression and other psychiatric disorders are literally just like diagnoses that we have come up with ourselves. So psychiatrists have kind of joined together in a room. They look at the current scientific research and they say, this seems like it is this disorder. This seems like it is a different one. And this is why I think as a schizophrenia researcher that, like, for example, schizophrenia might not be a single disorder. Like, we used to call it schizophrenias, and based on how we look at the disorder, it doesn't seem to fit neatly under one category. And this is a problem that we have with other disorders. So we have things that like OCD was linked as an anxiety disorder, and now it's not anymore. Like, we're constantly kind of renewing these terms and constantly changing what we think about it. And when it comes to depression, yeah, it's particularly hard because here's the thing. You can be depressed for a lot of different reasons. Like, you could be going through grief and you could have a minor episode of depression, but it's not enough to reach something like a diagnosis for major depressive disorder. You could have another disorder in which depression is comorbid. Maybe like depression is actually just because of a symptom of something else. Then we have things like bipolar, in which there's a lot of overlap with depression. So a lot of people are looking for specific ways to diagnose something. And that's where biomarkers come in. So biomarkers are the actual like physical numbers of things that you can be like, okay, this person's cortisol level is high, that means that they have depression. Now that is a purely hypothetical example because we don't have those good biomarkers for depressions. Like, we can't look at like levels of serotonin and be like, you have low levels of serotonin, you're depressed, even though kind of common belief is that we can. Now, instead, we have this kind of like constellation of different biomarkers. So they've looked at a variety of different things. And you can see this in this like sketchy little science triangle of things that they've tried. I'm not sure why it's a triangle. Pyramid, maybe? A food pyramid of depression. Anyways, they looked at things like blood and urine and sweat and things like brain scans. They also looked at things like hair and feces and cerebrospinal fluid. And what they found is that like all of those things are kind of hard to test. Like, people don't want to like bring in their poop to have it checked to see if they might have depression or not. Like, they probably would if required to, but it's not typically a thing that they enjoy doing. And going in and getting your blood drawn all the time, going in and getting your hair tested, yeah, that's not pleasant. And so they're like, what if we just looked at your breath? Now, what I mean here by breath is like the actual chemicals within your breath, so the volatile organic compounds. I am not talking about like just how much your breath smells. Now, we do see that in some people, when they have a depressive episode, they are less likely to do things like shower and brush their teeth because it's just incredibly difficult to become motivated to do so. But it is not necessarily that your just breath smells worse when you're depressed. Instead, it is specific chemicals in somebody's breath. And so they've been looking to see like how they can validate this. Like, what are those chemicals in somebody's breath that actually is linked to the likelihood of them being depressed or not? So in this study, they took 26 different people who had depression. So they had reached a diagnosis for major depressive disorder, and then they just kind of like checked it with another psychiatrist. And then 25 healthy controls, so who had no disorders whatsoever. And then they basically just like had them breathe into this device and then kind of like store their breaths and then send them in, which sounds like the start of like a really good dystopian science fiction novel. But I'm not a fiction writer, I'm a nonfiction writer. So if any of you want to take that idea, feel free. So they had people just store up their breaths and then basically look to see what chemicals are in them and how those chemicals are linked to things like biological functioning. So are they linked to things like stress? Are they linked to things like nutrition? And here's what they found. The most interesting finding was that butyric acid was actually decreased. This seemingly is linked to kind of like microbiome changes in somebody with depression. So what they see is that less butyric acid is actually linked to kind of less bacteria in your microbiome that are actually producing butyric acid, and that might be linked to a lower quality of life. Like, we know that we see microbiome differences in patients with depression. I did a really old video on this. I might remake it at some point. But we do see that that microbiome was affected for a lot of psychological disorders, and so maybe this biomarker could be good for depression, but maybe somewhat different yet similar ones could be good for things like ADHD. But then here comes that age-old problem of working with humans in science research. And what we see is that all of this is correlational. So there's less butyric acid in patients with depression, but it could actually be a consequence of the disorder. So not actually something directly linked to like the cause of the disorder, but potentially just something linked to like what happens when you have the disorder. So for example, what we see is that less butyric acid is associated with just exercising less, and we see that patients with depression typically exercise less. So like, is it linked to the beginning of the disorder? So could we use it to see if somebody's more likely to develop the disorder, or maybe to help them diagnose somebody with the disorder? Or is it just a thing that we see because of the disorder, so it's not actually that useful after all? There are also differences in other chemicals like isoprene. And what these actually mean, we don't know. So a more recent study that was looking at this kind of like breathonomics or breath analysis, brand new field that I didn't know existed, in this field, they are looking at a variety of different compounds. And in one study, they found that there were basically like 23 differences that they saw between people who had depression and people who did not have depression. And they were linked to like 5 different main areas. So maybe it's not just like isoprene plus butyric acid, like maybe it is like a combination of all of these different things. And if you have like XYZ plus ABC, you are more likely to have depression. And us neuroscientists, yeah, we're frantically searching for biomarkers, because not only do they help us understand a disorder, but they can also really help us help people with those disorders. Because a lot of times it ends up being an incredibly long process to actually get diagnosed with something. And it's more of a trial and error, and you're trying to figure out what works and doesn't work. And yeah, you're spending like months in some cases in despair. I'll keep you updated on what's coming up next, but for now at least, depression breath seems like it could be a thing.